just over a month ago, there was the murder of George Floyd. We want to send to his family condolences and solidarity. And I want to just say there are far too many people that have died and lost their lives at the hands of the police. We demand change. Some people both across the Atlantic and here say this is just a moment. We are going to insist that this is a movement and we demand change. I want to say that racism comes from the top of our society. I do not have to say to our American sisters and brothers about the problems of Donald Trump. The man is a fiend and a racist. He is at the moment attacking people on the basis of simply calling for justice. He comes up with false statements, encourages racism. We take the knee in support of Kirkpatrick, who took the knee then, and we will do this again. And thousands of people across the Atlantic have joined together in that. We're fighting the 3 Rs. First, the coronavirus. Let's be clear. This has devastated our communities. Black people have died. Black communities have died disproportionately. Hispanic communities have died disproportionately because the people at the top of our society have encouraged this. It's always been the people at the top of our society. Britain has a special place in terms of the slave movement. They're more worried about, Boris Johnson is more worried about a statue of Colston falling into the Bristol Channel. That's where he belongs, rather than the murder of millions of black people that were transported for cotton, sugar, and also to make money and exploitation across the world. It's a trade that we fought against from the beginning to the end, and it is the root and the development of racism both across the world historically, and that's why we reject it. So when we talk about decolonizing the world, we're talking about the truth of accepting that the last 400 years has been a disaster in terms of the level of racism and why we're going to resist it. That's the first R. The first R in terms of COVID, the second R in terms of racism, and the third R in terms of who pays for this crisis. We know that at the moment they plan for us to pay for this crisis, and that's the reason why we have to stand out against it. We want real change, and that's the reason why we have to make demands. I think it was Frederick Douglass says that power concedes nothing without a demand. And I believe when we look at this movement, this Black Lives Movement that's taken to the streets, it involves our young people, but it is a tradition that we stand in for many years. I don't have to say it to our brothers and sisters inside the United States that the civil rights movement transformed the world, the anti-apartheid movement transformed the world, and I believe that the Black Lives Matter movement will transform the world, provided we understand that we make these real demands. The transformation of making sure that resources are transformed from the police to where they're needed. Less prisons, more social support for people, more education for people, less in terms of criminalising them. And that's why we are putting forward a demand that we want the stop and search plans to be changed. I don't know how it affects people in terms of frisk and check inside America, but here it's devastating black communities. And that's why we want to make sure that instead of stopping people without giving them a reason, that that's changed. We also want to make sure there's a public inquiry about the disproportionate deaths. In this country, the lockdown was slow, it was improbable, it was incompetently handled. In fact, there's more resources, 100 million put into something called Prevent, which isn't about preventing disease, it's about attacking our Muslim brothers and sisters and seeing them as an enemy. In the same way as Trump targeted the Muslim community, the same way he put people, the Mexican community in cages. We have a racist system here that says that black lives don't matter if you're a refugee. We said that refugees are welcome here for wherever they come from. They shouldn't pay the consequences of what's taken place. The last thing I really want to say is that in terms of transforming this into movement, in terms of these demands being made into something that's practical and real, is that we have to make sure that our people that have been put in are made accountable, the people that speak for us, but also we have to make sure we build a mass movement. I believe it is the power of the mass movement that has transformed our world. I don't have to say this to Reverend Jackson. I don't have to say this to people, but we got our civil rights by struggling for it. We got the vote by struggling for it. We broke apartheid by struggling for it. And I believe we need a mass organizations to demand civil rights right now more than ever, because it reflects the future of generations that have been impacted by both the police, by the attack by a neoliberal society, and by the attempt, actually, I believe, to treat people as second-class citizens and embed it inside the state. The other thing we have to say, there's nothing wrong with black generals leading a multiracial army. The government and both Trump and Boris have been embarrassed that 77%, similar figure both in America and here, of black and white people have come together and said we want black and white unity to destroy racism. It is something that's important. There's nothing wrong with black leadership leading this, because we should never take a step back. And so I really want to end on that. We have to keep our hope, but we have to have organisation and the means to be able to do that. And at the end of the day, working people, people in the same position, have got nothing to lose. Sometimes people say you only need black faces in high places. I believe that that's not enough. We need to make sure that we have places in which people's real power comes from, their unity and their strength together. That is what they've always been afraid of. There was a Bacon revolt in the United States where black and white poor people came together and they were scared of that and they put the racist laws in. There was a reaction against the civil rights movement where they tried to use division to break us, but we broke through on that. I think they're going to try and do that this time. And we can achieve this if we understand that our unity and the ability not to give or give any concessions to those people that seek to divide us, because they always use divide and rule. They always use the question of their power to divide us. We have to use our strength, our organisation, our solidarity. And as Fred Hampton said, it's unity and solidarity that can lead to change. No justice, no peace. And I'm so happy to be here. Let's make sure that we make this change, not a moment, but a movement. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Wayman. As always, totally to the point and showing extraordinary leadership. My next speaker is coming to us all the way across the Atlantic. He's the Reverend Todd Yeary. He's a senior pastor of the Douglas Memorial Community Church in Baltimore, Maryland, United States, and he's a senior vice president of the Rainbow Push Coalition. Reverend Yeary.
Sister Diane Abbott, and to all of you, good afternoon. It is such a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to share at an important real-time discussion about a pandemic that is overwhelming the world in real time. Let me thank you for your commitment, your service, your leadership, not just there, but how that influences things everywhere else. You are indeed a jewel to this work, and I'm grateful to be able to share with you. Let me also say to Brother Wayman, I was saying amen while I was on mute over and over and over again. Preachers typically know a good sermon when they hear one. And so I appreciate you raising a good text and a good context for this conversation on today. We are in different time zones as we're having this conversation, but we are experiencing the same reality. And the reality is the 21st century furtherance of colonialism, which is to have de facto rule of key resources from a distance, to have the presence of control without having to physically contain it. And so the mindset of 2020 is much like the Berlin Conference of years ago. That the two things that the European powers had to demonstrate in order to claim priority of control on the continent of Africa is economic interest and the ability to militarily defend. And when we look at those two realities and how they are playing out in real time, controlling the assets, the resources, the minds, and the potential of peoples all across the world, it's important that we have this conversation and we renew a commitment, not just to be anti-racist, but to decolonize the minds and the realities of people across the globe. What we're seeing in real time is the death of bodies, the death of bodies. The pandemic known as the coronavirus is not only a threat to public health, it is also a furtherance of what I believe is a much more sinister reality. That this is the experience of genocide by public policy and government indifference without having to claim responsibility for one's own actions. And so the inaction leads to allowing that which we cannot see to control everything that we do see, and further the cause of retrenchment of the powers of the economic interests that we've known for hundreds and hundreds of years. I would say today that we have been tricked. We have indeed been tricked. One of my favorite movies is Spike Lee's movie Bamboozled. We have been bamboozled in real time because we've given lofty words to these notions of what equality ought be, but there's no substantive investment in changing the reality that has led to the disparities that we see all across the globe. And it's been reinforced by law. Sister Diane, you said that I'm speaking to you across the water. Unfortunately, that reality is true. Tomorrow, there will be a celebration of independence. But I would say to you that the United States has not ever accomplished anything independently. It has always come at the exploitation and the violent control of other people's interests and other people's resources. And so when we talk about Adam Smith's argument, what are we really fighting for in real time? Is we're talking about being anti-racist and decolonizing the resources. We've got to make sure that we protect two interests that Adam Smith says go to the wealth of nations, land and labor. There's exploitation of workers across the globe. And then there's the control of land very often by legalized forceful displacement. The first case I learned in law school in property law was a case called Johnson v. McIntosh. And at the end, just cutting across the field, the justification for being able to take priority interest over someone else's property right was an inheritance that had been learned from the mother country. And so the connection that we have is that what our peoples are experiencing are called by different national identities, but they are actually found in the same playbook. And so this notion of adverse possession is a property interest in US law that means that if you hostilely take property and you hold it long enough, openly claiming it as your own, eventually the ownership interest shifts to you. And so there are two things we're fighting for. If we're going to decolonize, and Brother Wayman, I'm going to say amen one more time to all that you said. I'm going to preach that sermon again. And I promise I will give you credit the first time. The second time, I'm going to say we collaborated. I hope you don't mind. There are two statuses, Sister Diane, we have to protect. One is the status of citizen. The other is the status of person. They have legal definitions and standings under the law, whether it is national law or international law. We have to not only protect them, we have to demand full implementation of the rights that go with them. It's either full citizenship or nothing at all. It's full personhood or nothing at all. It cannot be first-class citizenship for some, second-class citizenship for most. It's either we are getting our full entitlement or we will not be satisfied. Human dignity is a human right. And until we get the full spectrum of the rights that come with our human dignity, we will not be satisfied. And so as Brother Wayman said, no justice, no peace. Reverend Jackson says, keep hope alive. At the end of the day, I'm going to say, I want what's mine. Let's get it together. And Sister Diane, I'm glad to know I got a sister from another mister across the water who's going to help us make sure that we stay connected in this work. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you very much, the Reverend Yeri. I just wanted to read out some of the messages that we're receiving on Facebook. Louise Raw has reminded us that a racist British professor, David Starkey, still has the Order of the British Empire. She says if that doesn't bring the honour system into disrepute, what does? Stella George Dewsbury says, joined up working is what we all need. Time to rely on ourselves in order to move forward. We cannot continue to rely on those who have held us back for centuries. It is time. And we've got greetings from Stephen Lawrence Research Centre, DMU Leicester, from Sherilyn Pereira. But my next speaker is a Labour Member of Parliament from Streatham in South London. She was elected last year. She first came onto the national stage as an inspirational student activist, and she's one of a new generation of Black female parliamentarians who are the British equivalent of AOC and the Squad in the US Congress. I give you Ms. Bell Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you very much, Diane, and thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. I bring you greetings from the People's Republic of Streatham in South London, which, as well as covering Streatham, covers parts of Brixton, Tulse Hill, Balham and Clapham. We meet at a very, very important time in history, not a moment, but a pinnacle, a time in our movement. Now, I didn't learn much about Black history at school, as most of us in this country wouldn't have, but I do remember what my history teacher taught me in the first lesson. He made us all write it down in the front of our history books, and it said, we study the past to live the present with an eye on the future. And I think that couldn't be more important than now. And thinking of how we've come up in the past, now our Black civil rights movements across the world, there's nothing that has debilitated the Black community more than disunity within our communities. Now, of course, no one is saying that we are one homogenous group. We all have different views within our communities, but when we have stood together, when we have had a common goal, and that is literally just for our rights, just to be treated with the dignity we've deserved, we have achieved great things. Now, that's why I think it's so important that we are meeting today with brothers and sisters from across the pond. And I learned about the international solidarity that actually came about, that actually led to the end of colonialism in certain countries. I find it amazing that African and Caribbean leaders were meeting with civil rights leaders, Black civil rights leaders in the UK and the US, because they didn't have the miracle of Zoom, which we're using now. They didn't have all these apps to connect them across the world. They just about had plane travel and telephones, but they were able to achieve great things with that international solidarity, and we can learn a lot from that today. Now, we all know that the reinvigoration of the Black Lives Matter movement has started with the tragic killing of George Floyd, and looking at issues of policing and the injustice that people face there. But we know that as Black people, we suffer in so many other different areas, from education to employment. And that's why we need real systemic change, not tokenistic change. Now, one thing I would say about this particular point in time is that people are definitely paying attention. That's something that's made a difference in this point in time. They're paying attention and people actively want to make a difference. So it's important that we strike while the iron is hot, but it's also important that we look out for all of those individuals and organizations that in fact doing it on a tokenistic level. Because we know that at a time like this, people want to be seen to be doing something, not actually doing something. We need not to be fooled into believing that change is coming or accepting half-hearted measures of change. We need full equality, and that needs to be our aim, full stop. Now, I'm very much encouraged by also the reinvigoration of the idea to decolonize our education system, because I very much believe that no one is born racist. It's something that we learn. It's something that's instilled in us right from a very young age. And in the context of ending racial equality, we need to look at education if we're going to eradicate it. We need to address our shameful past and our shameful present, the history of slavery and colonialism. We need to be willing to inform and inspire the next generation, showing them why what's happened has created the society that we have, why it's wrong, and what they should be looking forward to. And that's really important, education, because racism is ignorance. And what is education if it's not the absence of ignorance? Now, in terms of this idea of educating people, it has to be something that's not, maybe put at the end of one lesson, talking about tokenism, or one day a week or one day a year. It has to be an integral part of every single section of our curriculum. Just like being committed to being anti-racism has to be something that we're doing in every single part of our lives, from our places of worship to our places of work, to our places of socializing. There are so many different areas in which we can create an anti-racist environment. Now, I also think about what I learned at school and how that actually impacted my sense of identity, because I didn't learn that much about my history and actually about how important my history is to this country. And it's not separate. It's not something that should be put in a month, because Black history is British history. Black history is world history. And I think about the world wars and how so much of the Commonwealth's involvement and those Black and Asian soldiers fighting so heavily in the war were erased. And that has completely made a difference, I feel, to people in the way they think about themselves coming up. So education, I think, is absolutely key. And as we move forward and we're fighting for racial equality, I know in this country, there are so many attempts to reinvent the wheel, all of these stalling attempts. So in the UK, we have a situation where we've had so many inquiries and reviews again and again and again, and people listing our inequalities. But the disgraceful thing about this, for every single one of those, there are a list of recommendations and things that can be done to make the lives and the experiences of Black people in our countries better. We know what needs to be done. We just have to make sure that we are demanding it and not letting people push us through this whole session. I mean, now we've got a situation where the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has announced a commission, and a commission is just another listing exercise. We know what the inequalities are. We know what we need to do to change them. We need the government to take action on every single part and inquiry that has gone on in the past and actually make those changes now. Now, we know that coming out of the coronavirus, Black communities are going to be hit the worst. We know that in 2008, when there was the economic crash and the subsequent austerity after that, that it was Black communities that fared the worst, less likely to have savings, less likely to be in certain jobs with higher wages, and this is affecting us moving forward, and has definitely exacerbated the issues in which we are seeing disproportionate deaths of Black people from the coronavirus. Now, all of those things are about to hit us again when we come out of the pandemic with what is set to be the worst, definitely for the UK, the worst economic recession we have seen ever, perhaps on record, and we know what happens when those economic recessions happen. So we have to be ready and willing to stand up and fight and make sure that we're not pushed into further issues as a Black community. And we need to make sure that we are fighting on every single front and every single issue that so I think I've got off. No, that we are fighting on every single issue and every single piece of legislation, like the racist immigration legislation that is being put forward, and that we are challenging our right to be able to speak as Black people. So when they say all lives matter, we need to tell them that we're not saying that all lives don't matter, but it's clear that Black lives do not matter, and that's why we are calling for it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Ribeiro-Addy. Thank you very much, Ms. Ribeiro-Addy, one of our inspirational young leaders. I want to read out a few comments from Facebook. Miriam Penwa says, thanks, and the only way is forward. Christian Holzberg from Brighton University sends solidarity greetings. And Robin Lofton says, human dignity cannot ever be compromised. Steve Cole says, Black Lives Matter is not just a moment, and I'd want to emphatically support that. Black Lives Matter is not an emotional spasm, it's an international movement for social justice. Ebony Kingston says, it's high time we decolonize the US and the UK school curriculum. Irene says that education is absolutely key to unlocking closed minds. So my next speaker is another speaker from the US, a leading campaigner. He is Professor Jonathan Jackson, an entrepreneur, social justice advocate, and the national spokesperson for Rainbow Push Coalition.
Hello, Diane.
Hello.
Diane Jesse Jackson, hello.
Hello.
Let me, before Jonathan, I want to thank you, Diane, and legacy of Bernie Grant for your struggles in our lifetime. I want to thank Dr. Du Bois and those who had the International African Congresses back in the turn of the century. I want to thank Reverend Todd Year, who is both Senior VP and DC Bureau Chief, outstanding pastor, PhD, and lawyer, just a brilliant brother. Speed and technology has dwarfed distance and time. Here we are together in a renewed sense today, and that's a big thing. If I left New York on the plane going to LA, you left going to London, we get up at the same time. We're just that close. It really is just across the pond. Mandela did not stay in jail 27 years to make police more civil at the end of apartheid, and that's our struggle today. Tomorrow we celebrate July the 4th here, Independence Day. I want Jonathan Jackson, who is our national spokesman, to deal a little bit about the British African-American connection. Africa is the foundation of the wealth of Britain and America. And so I want Jonathan to talk a bit about the Somerset case, and that leads into this July 4th in America tomorrow. Jonathan, are you on? Jonathan? He was on a moment ago. Is Jonathan muted? The point is that when he gets on, he'll make it in more detail. We celebrate 1776, the beginning of America, but we've been in slavery for 157 years when that happened. 157 years. It was a case involving an African from America and Britain in 1772, led to 1776. I want Jonathan to talk about that, the famous Somerset case in America. I'm so glad our family's together, and Diane, that's my real joy today, is our family is finally coming together. For the first one of us on one side of the pond and face the other. Boris and Trump are twins.
Yeah.
And so are we. and we're gaining strength across both sides of the pond. Diane, you're an international jewel. I do want Jonathan to come on momentarily. Talk a bit about the Somerset case, because it shows just how when the wilberforces of your side of the pond came into prominence, an anti-slavery movement in Britain, it all tied into what we're doing here. So it's amazing how we didn't have Zoom connection at that time, but we were still fighting in real time, as Todd would say, to liberate ourselves from our oppression. Jonathan is on yet? Is he on? Is he on? Boy. So Diane, let me say to you, I want to move on. James Gomez has been our interlocutor. James is from the Gambia. He is our International Affairs Director at Rainbow Push Coalition. We thank James Gomez so much. And I want to express my thanks for being able to be on the call today. And we'll try to do a little technical stuff to get Jonathan, but Jonathan has been involved very deeply in this struggle. And I want to thank him, Todd and James on this side of the pond. Thank you, Diane.
Could I say thank you myself to James Gomez, who's helped make this possible. And just while we're waiting, Jonathan, read out some more comments from Facebook. Deepak Panchal says, I don't think social struggles in the US and UK are very different. We're living in the same reality. Anthony Johnson says, we have had enough. We won't stop until we end inequality and racial oppression. I think that whilst we're sorting out some technical issues, I think I want to call on Kwame Kwei-Armah. Kwame Kwei-Armah is a British actor, playwright, theatre director and broadcaster. He's very appropriate to speak on this transatlantic lineup because from 2011 to 2018, he was the very successful artistic director of the famous Baltimore Center Stage Theatre. and he's now the artistic director of one of Britain's leading theatre companies, the Young Vic. Kwame is one of Britain's leading theatre professionals, but he has the heart of an activist. I'm going to hand over to Kwame now. Kwame.
Bless you, Diane. Thank you so much for your kind words, your lovely introduction. And I can now say I followed the Reverend Jesse Jackson and Diane. I'm overjoyed to add that to my CV. And thank you for asking me to join today. Yes, you're absolutely right. I think as an artist, if you're not an activist, and then there is something that is not aligning correctly. And I'm not going to take terribly long today because I affirm everything that was said before about reparations. I affirm everything that was said before about education and Black history being British history, being world history. And I affirm that that we need to make sure that we have a fundamental and proper review of COVID and its effects on the Black and Brown community here in Britain. And I affirm that this is not just a spasm, but this will be part of an everlasting reaction to white supremacy. And I feel it's really important that we continue to speak, that we continue to commune together wherever we are in the world as diasporic Africans, that we continue to speak truth, not to power, but speak truth to the ear of those who may have not been listening as well as they may be listening now. But I say all of that because I loved the comment earlier on by Bill about history, because history for me is everything. It is the past, the present, and tomorrow. And just a little over 100 years ago today, a West Indian American poet called Claude McKay wrote a rather wonderful poem called If We Must Die. And I just want to read from Wikipedia why he wrote it. It said, If We Must Die is a poem by Claude McKay published in July 1919. He wrote the poem as a response to mob attacks by white Americans upon African-American communities during the Red Summer. 1919, 100 years ago, talking to what we are talking to now. I want to read that poem because I think it says a lot. And please remember that it refers in gender terms to men, and it was written in 1919. If We Must Die, by Claude McKay. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making mock of our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe, though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. For what though before us lies the open grave? Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Now I'm sure that Claude would say, like people will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. But as I said, that was written in 1919. And what that poem teaches me is that the continuum of our struggle is everlasting. We stand on the shoulders of everyone who has fought and who has died and who has lost a dream and who has been pained by dreams deferred. We stand on their shoulders and we honor them at this moment. I am so proud, in particular, of our young Black women who have led this Black Lives Matter movement, who have said that I know, even though we are also, as women, dying in record numbers, let us stand and protest and lead and speak about the deaths of our brothers, our fathers, our uncles, and our husbands. And as I see these young people, 21, 24, walking in the streets of London, saying that we would rather face COVID than live in a world where white supremacy makes itself manifest in this way time and time again, my heart leapt with joy. And so I end by saying, thank you, Diane. Thank you, everyone, for making sure we can commune on this subject, for making sure that we keep it in the ears and the hearts of everyone that this matters to. This is not just a moment in history. This, I profoundly believe, will be a turning point. More strength to your hearts, more strength to your spirits and your minds.
Thank you very much, Kwame. I believe we're going to be joined by Professor Jonathan Jackson, but before we go to him, I just want to read out a few more comments from Facebook. Irene quotes Rev Jesse Jackson and says, "Boris and Trump are twins," a classic line. Elizabeth says, "Amazing, Jesse Jackson in my living room," amen to that. John Margam says, Black Lives Matter has given oxygen to many oppressed Black brothers and sisters. But it now gives me great pleasure for Professor Jonathan Jackson, entrepreneur and an activist and a spokesperson for Rainbow Coalition Push, to join us and give us the benefit of his thoughts. Professor Jonathan Jackson.
How are you? Thank you for having me, and God bless you and our family across the seas. As we look at this continuum of uninterrupted history, of progress, of God's will moving through humanity, I think of the case of James Somerset and versus Stewart. That was the case that preceded the 4th of July, 1776 in the United States of America. As we recall, the British government had encouraged the Americans that were slavers to not bring the African Americans that they had enslaved over to the UK, because when they came over to the UK, they would start acting different, because the United Kingdom had relationships with Jamaicans and Africans across the world. And so this one curious case of Mr. James Somerset, a young man that was kidnapped from West Africa, was trained to be a butler valet, if you will, in Boston, and his owner, a term I despise, we've got to fix that language, a kidnapper, shall I say, took this young man over to the UK, and he was Christianized. He had godfathers, and when Mr. Stewart thought that he was getting too uppity, he had him put on his ship to be sent back to Jamaica, where they would do the slave breaking. Mr. Granville Sharp, the noted abolitionist, filed habeas corpus on behalf of the young man and brought him before the courts. The doctrine of having a body before the court. That was a big deal after 153 years of American slavery, that a young man would finally get a chance to have a day in court. And as the case was ultimately decided, he was made free in the United Kingdom, having been kidnapped from West Africa and having been raised in America, and now he was finally free. That set the foundation for 15,000 other African descendants to be freed in the UK. That's 1772, 4 years before the 4th of July. And that's when the word had gotten out across the colonies that indeed the British were going to get out of slavery, and the Americans wanted to create a peculiar institution where they had slavery in its constitution, where all men and women were in fact not created equal. And so that's my thoughts on the 4th of July. This is a battle of freedom that travels the world through humanity. One last thing I would like to leave with you on that is that when we think of where we are now, it was the abolitionist spirit in the UK. It was Lord Mansfield, the judge that decided that case. It was Granville Sharp that brought the young man before the case. And so ours is just not about color, it's about the flesh and blood, the spirit. And so we have many good allies that are white and others that fight for this. And when we think of the American Revolution with the, if you will, the transcendentalists, Mr. Emerson and Thoreau. Thoreau got his inspiration not to cooperate with evil from the Bhagavad Gita. He's the one that started civil disobedience, if you will, not participating in evil. Mahatma Gandhi was inspired by Thoreau, and ultimately Reverend Martin Luther King and many other African-American ministers learned their techniques of nonviolent resistance from Mahatma Gandhi. So it's the spirit of God that I attribute this to. And I want to say, fight on and keep hope alive in the spirit of my father, the Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Thank you very much, Professor Jackson. I just want to read out some more of the comments on Facebook. We've had a number of comments about Kwame's wonderful remarks, and Christine said, so powerful, so beautiful. Thanks for this, Kwame. We have over 1,600 people viewing this event on Facebook and YouTube. And now I want to move on to our next speaker from America, Bishop Tavis Grant, a faith leader and activist, and the senior pastor of the Greater First Baptist Church in East Chicago, Indiana.
Well, I should say good evening to you, and good afternoon to those of us who are here in the United States. Ms. Abbott, you are tremendous, and your reputation far exceeds the borders of both of our countries, and we appreciate your service and your commitment to liberation. Of course, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who is in and of himself an African-American and global icon. James Cone said to us, indeed, our survival and liberation depends on a recognition of a truth that is spoken and is lived. He is a pioneer as it relates to Black liberation theology. And currently, as we look at what we're facing globally with a pandemic that is sweeping the planet, knows no borders, and is not discriminate on who it will infect, it has yet impacted disproportionately people of color all over the country and all over the world. And as we look at global shifting politics, we're facing the most critical election here in the United States that will impact what happens in many places around the world, including there in London. One of the challenges that we have is realizing that our need to collaborate and our need to connect and our need to build coalitions in such a way that we can constructively dismantle not just not just colonialism, but the very core of racism and poverty and the disparities that they bring across our globe. Our challenge today, as we really reminisce and reflect on seeing the vile and violent, vicious murder of George Floyd that caused many Americans and people of all walks to take the streets and to reinforce and re-engage the King principles of nonviolent protests. We've seen the response, and yet there's still a deafening ear to the cries and the calls of change globally, particularly for people of color. We must begin to deal with, in a very constructive way, the disparities of wealth, disparities of income, disparities in healthcare, disparities in political and social structures, to move beyond tokenism and apologies. We are experiencing now in the United States any number of statues that are being pulled down. Those are figurative at best. What we need is real systemic structural change that affords all Americans, particularly Black Americans and people of color, to have what is called equality. Many, many years ago, there was a war on poverty where $22 trillion was spent, and still poverty exists. We've had 3 various wars with $3 trillion spent, and in our nation, we spend $59 a day on the poor. And so poverty becomes a real challenge for us. Education becomes a tremendous challenge for us. And then economic access to wealth and capital. Last but not least, we must do what we're doing on this forum today across these borders and across the water. One, we must be politically engaged. We have more in common than we have differences. Reverend Jackson is absolutely correct. Boris and Trump are twins. And our challenge must be a 1-2 punch. This is not a 1-round fight. This is 12 rounds, and we must be politically engaged. Secondly, we must be economically engaged. While we're waiting for people to change, this has become the greatest wealth transfer that we have seen in the past 50 years, where the wealthy continue to make money and the poor continue to stay at the bottom. We must also equally become educationally and technology engaged and socially engaged in such a way that we are knitted together in a synergy that takes our fight to wherever we are as it relates to representing the poor, the left out, and the least of these. I do want to thank you again, Diane Abbott, and thank you, Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Thank you very much, Bishop Grant, for your very wise words. I want to read out some more comments from Facebook and YouTube. Tams in Black on YouTube says, "It has mobilized me to see so many young Black women finding their voice and using it so eloquently and so bravely." Michelle says on Facebook, "Racism is a stain on the fabric of society." And Izzy Phoenix on YouTube says, "It is so wonderful to listen to such knowledgeable speakers that really care." Now, my next speaker is someone who does indeed really care. She's been a lifelong campaigner for social justice. She's the joint chair of the British Civil Rights Campaign, Stand Up to Racism. She's Sabi Dalu. Sabi.
Thank you. Apologies for that. I'm not sure what happened there. It's a great honor and privilege to be joining such a magnificent platform here this evening. And I thank everyone for your contribution and for being here this evening. I would just want to address a few issues. So I think one of the issues I'd like to address firstly is when the Black Lives Matter movement took off a few weeks ago, across the globe, people were demonstrating in solidarity, including here in Britain, in large numbers, very large numbers. Hundreds of thousands of people were taking to the streets across the globe, including here in Britain. And many people here were asking, well, why is this happening? Like, why now? How come the death of George Floyd, or the killing of George Floyd in America, has ignited such large protests here? How come when people like Mark Duggan, when people like Sheku Bayo or Sean Rigg, why didn't we, these are people that died in police custody here in this country, why did we not see the same size demonstrations here? And I think the answer to that question is twofold. So I think firstly, when Black Americans rise in the belly of the beast in the USA, it reminds people of the civil rights struggle. And that's why it's such an honor to be here with Jesse Jackson, because that movement was, an international movement. There was solidarity with the Vietnamese in opposing the Vietnam War. And there was also solidarity, as Ben Ribeiro-Addy said earlier, with the independence struggles in Africa taking place at the same time. And for those people that left Asia and Africa and lived in Britain and in other European countries, I think the civil rights movement gave people a lot of hope. in the 1960s. And I think that the Black Lives Matter movement today is giving people across the globe that same hope and inspiration. So I think, you know, it's tremendous that this movement is happening, but I think it's important that we keep up the momentum, because I agree with what people have said earlier. This is not a moment, this is a movement, and we have to keep up the fight. I think the other reason why we've seen so many large Black Lives Matter protests across the globe is because of the triple whammy of police brutality, COVID-19, and the economic contraction. All of those three things are disproportionately impacting Black communities, and that has just ignited an international movement. So I think these three reasons, and the massive loss of life, plus of COVID-19, plus the massive economic contraction, has also meant that many white people are not only joining the protests on the streets in large numbers in the US, also we're seeing that in Britain, in Europe, you know, Germany, seeing massive demonstrations of a lot of white people on the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. I think these, the criminal approach of many governments to COVID-19 and just allowing a loss of life when they could have taken more decisive action, and the economic situation, I think this means that public opinion is now on the side of the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is indeed a historic moment that we have to build on. And then I think also one of the biggest problems that we're seeing of the Black communities, both in Britain and in the US, is the criminalization of the Black communities. Because we're in the USA, as people here know, African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white people. Here in Britain, the Black, Black, African, Caribbean and Asian minority ethnic population combined make up only 14% of the population, but 25% of the prison population. So these disparities are taking place both in the USA and here in Britain. And so I think what this points to, this mass criminalization of our communities, is that we need to have an approach where we acknowledge that policing is not the only solution to crime. I think there needs to be more investment in the social and other factors that cause crime, and not just looking at punishment and, you know, criminalizing communities. So I think that is a very important discussion that we must start and build on here and in the US with our colleagues there. And obviously, I think here in Britain, well, I think one thing that's very interesting is that in the USA, the officers, because of the pressure of the movement, the officers that killed George Floyd, or that were involved in George Floyd's killing, have been charged. And it would obviously be very interesting to see what happens, whether those police officers are indeed convicted, because that will truly be, if they are, then that will truly be a historic moment and a massive achievement. But in the UK, no police officer has ever been charged for the death of a Black person in police custody or after police contact. So I think we really need to here put the pressure on to make sure that those officers responsible are suspended and charged, and that action is taken. There is prosecutions of those police officers. So I think that's very important for us to build on here. And then finally, I want to echo the words of Todd Yeary, that we need to campaign for the decolonization of minds. And I think the best way of doing that is through the education system. So here, the wonderful National Education Union, which is a massive supporter of stand up to racism and anti-racism campaigns in general, has launched a campaign to decolonize education. And I think that's really important, because the Black Lives Matter movement and the pulling down of the statues, whilst it was symbolic in nature, it did more to educate people of the Britain's role in slavery, its colonial and imperial past, than years of education did. So this is very important, and it's been hugely inspiring. as someone who's been active in the anti-racist movement for 2 decades now, to see the British people confronting their role, Britain's role in slavery and colonialism, and the loss of life that caused, is, this is for the first time in 200 years since the abolition of slavery, is truly inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abby. I just want to read out a few more comments from Facebook. Sarah Qureshi has written, thank you. Hand in hand, we are stronger, from a Muslim South Asian sister. And Apishi's Day said, absolutely correct and wise, Sabi. The economic realities on the ground in the US and UK have brought communities together, desperate for change. And now I come to our star speaker, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who I've known for 30 years. He is an internationally known campaigner for human rights. He's been a civil rights leader from all the way in the 1970s. In 1988, he fought an electrifying campaign to be the Democratic Party candidate for the presidency of the United States. And I would always say, without Jesse Jackson, there would have been no Barack Obama. He was at the side of Martin Luther King and is still an internationally known campaigner for racial justice. I give you the Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Love you, Miss Diane. Let me see, the question was raised, why now? The concept called the fullness of time. After many abuses, there comes a time when the cup runneth over. So George Floyd was the fullness of time, a turning point in our struggle. We recognize the power of marching feet and the voting coalition. We march and fight back, we always win. I do want to recognize the Pan-African Congress of the 19th century, where people like Du Bois and others met in London, a 3-week trip across the ocean on boats. Now we can talk in real time. What a difference. All we're free but not equal. A lot of time has been sitting here, Diane, on police behavior, which is atrocious, but police patrol us, they don't control us. When we get to civilizing police, they seal something called banks, investment policy, insurance policy, pensions. Lastly, effort and excellence. Effort and hard work means a lot. Inheritance and access means more. We can't use all our energy on police alone, because they are the gatekeepers. Behind the gate, the powers that run our systems. And I would urge us to show our commitment. Now, something that's happening in America that's a good thing. The day before George Floyd was criminalized in Minnesota, the day before the election, the same Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed, a Black woman is now the mayor of that city. A right winger from Iowa was defeated by white people in Iowa on the same day. Last Tuesday, a Black came on the point of becoming the senator from Kentucky. Matter of fact, now look over these past few years, my heart rejoices. Montgomery, Alabama, Dr. King began to boycott. Black mayor now, a relevant guy. Selma, Alabama, we marched right to vote, a Black mayor. Birmingham, Alabama. Dallas, Houston, really on the move. And so no matter what Boris Johnson does, no matter what Trump does, the winds of history are on our side. And we will win this battle. I feel more excited today than ever before. Something good is happening out of this flurry of activity. As I see whites voting for Blacks in ways we've never seen before. At the end of the day, we all want some truth. Why is the Blacks so well on the football field with soccer in Britain, football in America? Whenever the playing field is even, rules are public, goals are clear, referees are fair, and the score is transparent, we can make it. We fight for an even playing field. Even rules public go we can make it. So I want to thank you, Diane, again for this call today. I want to thank James Umez in a big, big, big way, Reverend Todd Yeary, Bishop Grant, Jonathan Jackson. I look forward that we can meet again face to face, big rallies of our own agenda in London and in America. Thank you, and God bless you, Diane.
Thank you very much, Reverend Jackson. I want to read out some more from people participating on Facebook. Becca says, George Floyd's death was something we just couldn't look away from. It highlighted what Black people face every day. Sharon Grant says, the National Education Union is fantastic, full support for their members and their anti-racism work. And in closing this event, first of all, I wanted to thank the Stand Up to Racism technical team and Nima Hussain and Jenny Francis in my office who put the whole event together. I want to thank all of you who have participated on YouTube and Facebook. I also want to say this, that one of the reasons why the death of George Floyd and the exceptionally cruel way that he was killed by a US police officer resonated here in Britain is because we know about state violence. We have a terrible issue with deaths in custody, and the history of slavery, colonialism, and empire was a violent history. And of course, I think one reason why the Black Lives Matter movement has taken off in the way it has done in Britain, the United States, in a way it didn't at the first time it emerged, is because Black people are under the shadow of coronavirus, with a disproportionate number of Black deaths on both sides of the Atlantic. And there could not be a more appropriate cry than Black Lives Matter when so many Black people are dying from coronavirus. I think there are many inspirational things about the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the inspirational things is the numbers of young people in positions of leadership. It is a new generation, and I think we need to celebrate that. The other inspirational thing is how it's brought both Black people and white people out on the street to challenge racism and to fight for racial justice. And the inspirational thing, I think, above all, is the Black Lives Matter movement is saying, when we consider the issue of racial justice, if not now, when? And if our generation cannot fight for it, who will? I think the Black Lives Matter movement has a very long way to go. I think there is a lot to learn from what is being said and done about decolonizing curriculum, about looking about the amount of money we spend on policing and whether we shouldn't be spending equivalent amounts of money on the youth service and mental health and community work. And just to close, finally, I suppose a cry that you've heard in so many Black Lives demonstrations, both in Britain and America, no justice, no peace. Thank you very much for my speakers, and thanks to all of you who have listened to and participated in this event. Good night. And